So my capstone, in essence, is about video games. More specifically, I chose to look at first-person shooter video games that feature modern depictions of war. And by this, I mean it's a certain genre of games that have the player engaging in a first-person perspective under the backdrop of modern military conflict. And these are titles such as Call of Duty, Battlefield, and America's Army, all of which I looked at and analyzed for my project. To understand why any of this matters, the depictions, representations of these games, and a real-world connection between games like Call of Duty and U.S. military recruitment, we must understand how the video game industry got here. The industry, in less than half a century, turned itself into a complete behemoth of an industry, and it now rivals and outsells Hollywood movies, best-selling books, and music. Games like Call of Duty are played by millions of people every day, and key to my project is to understand the consequences of these games' images, themes, and a real-world military sponsorship behind them, and how this shapes dominant ideology of military culture and gender politics. Also key to this project is the fact that video games are a commodity to be bought and sold. They are meant to make a profit for the company that developed the game. And with this understanding, the economic functioning of video games is no different than any other form of various popular media in today's world, including films, books, magazines, etc. As video games get more popularized into an international mass consumer marketplace, many big budget releases are featuring advertising campaigns, corporate sponsorships, and celebrity endorsements. All these developments leave us to try and grasp the consequences of this constantly thinning line between entertainment and war. Standardization is another important development in understanding how modern video games are being commodified. This continuous process of popularization that happened in the early 2000s from great success of titles like Call of Duty has led to a major streamlining of games to fit the mold for a larger audience. With a game like the new Call of Duty that will sell millions of copies worldwide, it's important to understand how ideology is being displayed for these games and how it's being interpreted by its large audience, and thus its larger connection to the dominant political ideology of the US government and military institutions. This standardization means that basically all games are mirroring each other's styles, themes, gameplays, representations, albeit usually very reductive themes and representations, leads us to a point in modernity where the archetype for a successful war-themed shooter is constantly being duplicated. As I said, video games perpetuate ideology just like any other media, and in the case of Call of Duty and other first-person shooter games, often depicting extremely violent modern warfare featuring real historical conflicts in a form of push-button interactive entertainment. Through this, we must understand and question how these games perpetuate dominant ideologies of real-world military institutions to their mass audiences. This advancement could not be seen any more clearly than in the 2002 release of the game America's Army. This was the first fully funded, developed, and published game by the United States Army, and this game was not made for profit, for the purpose of profit, but rather the sole intention to inform, educate, and recruit prospective soldiers into the US military. I will now play a clip from the trailer of that game. So this title, America's Army, outperformed many of the other first-person shooters around the same time of its release in the early 2000s, and the game was heavily promoted by the US Army, as well as you just saw through commercials like that. This game's success paved the way for future military gaming endeavors and proved that the gaming industry can be a highly effective form of military recruitment. In 2008, MIT study even found that 30% of all Americans aged 16 to 24 had a more positive impression of the Army because of playing America's Army. And even more amazingly, the game had more impact on recruitments than all other forms of Army advertising combined. Through its success, America's Army spawned several sequels and spin-offs, all relatively dealing with simulating a US soldier's experience who is stationed in the Middle East. The series is still going strong, and the US Army confirmed in 2018 that America's Army 5 will likely be out in the next 4 years, another aspect of its continuous standardization. Everything from promotion, the setting, advertising, and the subject matter of the original America's Army's titles align greatly with US normative recruitment strategies. This entails glorifying the US soldiers in the Army to a mythological degree, blatant notions of exceptionalism and nationalism, a mirroring of the socio-political climate of the US at the time, thus the early titles in the early 2000s and the build up to the Iraq War, dehumanization of the enemy combatant, and an important emphasis on the current war or campaign they are fighting is for the sake of freedom, and the enemy is an oppressive regime. This strategy was clearly employed by the US military throughout the 20th century, and it can be seen in the game America's Army as well. This approach, and America's Army for that matter, can be seen as a part of America's large military influence, and as I said before, the build up to the Iraq War. With releasing America's Army's titles on almost all systems now, including mobile, Xbox 360, PlayStation, and computer, the series effectively becomes an ideological tool for the US Army to promote and sanitize its military interests and its ideology as just mere entertainment and franchise to be bought and sold. No longer does the content need to be openly a blatant propaganda message of militarism. To comment on this, US Army said on its official website that the game's sole purpose is that they want to show the world how great the US Army really is. Researcher David Nieberg describes this process as the America's Army platform. To describe the format used by the US Army game developers that carefully balances entertainment, education, and propaganda in order to make a very effective game in terms of perpetuating dominant ideological themes. In this manner, this process is being constantly replicated by other world governments now to great degrees of success. And his notion of the America's Army platform is one of the key frameworks I analyzed throughout my project. David Nieberg previously mentions how no other army in the world can afford a free high-tech game for mass distribution. But what we're seeing in modern developments is actually quite the contrary. In 2011, Glorious Mission was the first fully released, developed and produced game by the People's Liberation Army for the Chinese mainland audience. Glorious Mission directly follows in the America's Army platform put forward by David Nieberg that it attempts to balance entertainment, education, military training, and to promote the ideology of China's political and military endeavors. The game released with two different versions, one to the public that was free, that had campaign and cooperative modes, and the other one was meant solely to train people prospectively going to be recruited into the military or actively trained soldiers that are in the military. The way in which governments, and more interestingly, nations with large military geopolitical power, such as the US and China, have both made high-tech games that are used for the sole purpose of promoting the ideology of their respective military and government shows how successful and potent the America's Army platform is, and video games in terms of recruitment in general. Especially how it can influence a young player base on the opinions of a military conquest or a military force, and whether this be the People's Liberation Army, Israel, France, or even the United States Army. The technological realism of video games is also greatly improving every year. We are seeing war-themed shooting games, the genre of war-themed shooting games, being implemented on systems such as VR and augmented reality now. For this, I must claim that the America's Army platform model developed by Nieberg is potentially already outdated due to the fast-paced changing of the industry. And this does not mean that everything I just said is not relevant or should be thrown out. What I mean by this is the America's Army platform is constantly reinventing itself in various new ways based on the technologies that video game developers are now able to access. US Army has already used VR and AR technologies to train recruits and set up VR experience stations at marketing events such as the X Games and other esports competitions to great success. More than ever, we are experiencing this thinning of the line between entertainment and war. I will now discuss the modern development of rebranding in the US Army. In 2018, the US Army missed its recruitment goal for the first time since 2005. After this, the US Army developed a new approach that would pitch itself to a greater, more susceptible audience found in the gaming world. Along with this development, the US Army announced the creation of an official US Army esports team. And through this platform, active military personnel will be competing in competitive tournaments of popular games such as Call of Duty, League of Legends, Fortnite, etc. The US Army's current rebranding also features recruiters getting sent to popular video game conventions and marketing events and setting up booths, which they did also with the buildup of America's Army. But what differs in this aspect now is that they are shedding their normal military gear and now instead wearing the official US Army esports team jersey. This modern development of US Army actively creating esports team using social media influence, live streaming, and wearing designer jerseys is an attempted rebranding by the US military institutions to shed the previous image of being a warmonger. Through this, they are attempting to appeal to the large, diverse player base that is represented in the gaming world. And this can be seen as a direct contrast to the previous America's Army platform that was seen employed by the US military all throughout the early 21st century. In the way that this new rebranding method seeks to pacify and erase the legacy of violence committed by the US Army. And then in turn, rebranding this image as cool, hip, and trendy. This all culminates to create our modern predicament of how powerful institutions such as the state can perpetuate ideology from mediums once thought to be mere child's play, such as video games. And through this, the realm of video games is largely perpetuating ideology just as the form as any other media. With militaries across the world now using video games as training devices for recruits, we have to ask ourselves now how to reclaim and define the lines between entertainment and warfare, which leads me to my final section, what is to be done? While this project is largely meant to be critically analyze multiple different sectors of the video game industry, it is also mentioned that there are several ongoing developments pushing back against the very same systems that I mentioned in this project. Many of these public backlash and forms of activism seek to push back against very reductive and harmful representations, and along with also, as I mentioned, the pipeline of video games and military recruitment. And this leads us to the question of what would a progressive game even look like? And while I talked largely today about the biggest names in the video game industry that easily rake in billions of dollars every year, and where everything is just a means and end to maximize their profit, it should also be noted that there is a thriving independent game movement that often subverts harmful representations and the corporate and military connections of industry giants. That being said, we still have to take into account the economic model in which games are produced. In terms of combating these systems, in 2020, House Progressives introduced a bill to the US Congress that would prohibit the US military from using recruitment and promoting strategies in the realm of video games and esports. This bill, though it failed to be passed, we're still seeing a major wave of public dissatisfaction with the military actively using technology such as video games for a recruitment platform. There was also other recent developments where everyday people staged mass cyber protests that forced the US Army esports team to eventually suspend their accounts until they could figure out how to deal with the backlash. These cultural battles are happening every day and constantly changing, and the forms of resistance will change as well. With US military and militaries across the world, including Great Britain, Israel, China, and France, already using combat-style video games to either promote positive views of the military or actively train recruits, we need to understand how severe and important this research is due to the ever-constant growth of the first-person shooter genre and how it perpetuates these themes to a large player base and its extreme effectiveness, while also potentially seeing how catastrophic the results from interlacing these harmful themes are, such as reductive masculinity, violence, American hegemony, and real-world military recruitment. These virtual battles will continue to change and persist, and this research will also need constant changing and analysis as these developments progress.